Hi there, and welcome to Product Tank. If you have attended one of our events, welcome back. If you're new, welcome. My name is Elina. I'm one of the Product Tank organizers in London, and I will be your host tonight. Before we get started with our amazing speakers, let's just briefly go through the quick history of Product Tank and also cover how you can get involved with our events and more. So we have become the world's largest product community, and actually, Product Tank was started just here in London in a pub by product people. Currently, London Product Tank is present in more than 200 cities around the world, and we are basically working under the umbrella of Mind the Product. And together, our mission is very simple. We want to make product people better and more successful and share knowledge and help each other to grow and improve. There's plenty of ways how you can get involved within the community. So the first one is you can speak at the Product Tank. Pandemic has worked out quite nicely, meaning that we've been able to actually host virtual events like this. So as a speaker, you can get involved with any kind of Product Tank in 200 cities. You can just get in touch with your local Product Tank organizers. You can also host or sponsor a Product Tank, so you could be in the shoes of myself. You could also write for Mind the Product if you have anything useful or anything specifically you'd like to share within the community. And you can become a Mind the Product member for even more content and more special events. You can also contribute towards the next year's Product Tanks. We'll be sending out a survey very shortly, and we would love your opinion regarding what kind of topics, what kind of issues would you like us to curate and discuss next year. So a couple of words in tonight's event. Stakeholders are people too, and it seems that sometimes we forget about it. We look at stakeholders as a chore. Sometimes we run into issues, and we kind of bundle them into a matrix or into a framework, and actually forget that they are people too. They have their roles, they have their own goals, they have their own quirks, and they work in the exact same way as we do. So I'm very excited about today's talk because it will basically take a step back and explore how take a human-centered approach to your stakeholders, and remember that they are people just like you. So I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker, Tanya, is a strategic HR professional with 12 years of experience, gained through senior positions across creative, media, advertising, and not-for-profit, such as Saatchi & Saatchi and Great Ormond Street Children's Charity. She has now founded TalentWise Consulting to support organizations with bespoke HR and learning and development initiatives to attract, retain, engage, and develop their people. She is also an accredited MBTI facilitator with a coaching qualification in progress at the Institute of Leadership and Management. And Tanya will explore how people differ in the way they take in information and make decisions, and how you can apply the learnings with working with stakeholders using tips and tricks from psychometric testing. So I'll just pass it on to Tanya.
Hi, so thank you for such a lovely introduction. So my name's Tanya. I'm going to be talking you through how you can use MBTI principles to figure out your stakeholders. So let me begin. Just a second. So MBTI stands for the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It's based on the personality theories of the psychologist Carl Jung and was developed by two non-psychologists, Briggs and Myers. They're actually a mother-daughter team, and they wanted to give as many people as possible access to Jung's personality framework. And that's why it's called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, because it helps you identify which of Carl Jung's 16 personality types you might be. It's one of the few models of personality that describes differences in a positive way, and there are no right or wrong types to be. So it talks about each type having its own strength and having its own blind spots. As there's no right or wrong type to be, it's a really useful and constructive psychometric tool and framework for use in the workplace. It's used by a majority of the top FTSE Fortune 100 companies because people find it insightful and beneficial. On the left, I've highlighted some of the key organisations that use it that are actually used as case studies by the MBTI organisation because they've used it so well. Because it's got this repeated application across personal development and team building, in addition to addressing business challenges that include problem solving, reaction to change, communication preferences, stress reactions, emotional intelligence, conflict style, all of that leads to significant ROI and greater understanding because the same framework is being used across multiple areas. So each time you revisit it, even if it's for something new, you're still enhancing your understanding of it. It's also been supported by 20 years of research just to actually build that tool. So the questionnaire that Myers and Briggs built took 20 years. And then it's gone on to have over 10,000 peer-reviewed scientific research papers showing it's got high validity and reliability. And it meets all the rigorous testing that you need for the official psychometric testing. So the results of the actual questionnaire lead to descriptions and characteristics of 16 different personality types. And each of these types have its own blind spots and has its own strengths. And so what can appear to be random variations in differences to people are actually quite ordered and consistent. And instead they're because people, they prefer to take in information and make decisions in different ways. And then people of these 16 different types are likely to differ in their reactions, interests, values, and motivations. These differences can be a source of misunderstanding, or they can be a source of strength if they're actually capitalized by an organization. So let me talk to you now about the concept of preference, which is one of the key things about MBTI. It's all about how people prefer to do things. So I'm going to start this by giving you a physical example. So what I'd like you to do here is I'd like you to fold your arms for me. So just fold it how you naturally would. And take a pause to just feel what that feels like. Now fold them the other way, so as though you were going to put the other hand on top. Notice how that feels, how unnatural that might feel, and that you might want to get back to your natural way of doing something. This is what I mean by when it comes by preference, which is what we do in MBTI. It doesn't mean you can't do the other thing, but it doesn't mean that it's your preferred way of doing something. So it might take a bit more energy. It might take a bit longer for you to do. It might feel a bit clunky, a bit unnatural and not like you. But imagine those pictures of those people folding their hands and looking at people. You wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that someone was acting out of preference because it still might look exactly the same. And that's an important thing to remember about preference. It's not always obvious if someone is acting out of preference. You can't assume that what their preferred way of doing something might be. But understanding what your stakeholders' preferences might be and then adapting accordingly could get you quicker, more effective results. So these are the 4 preference pairs. So MBTI looks at personality based on 4 fundamental dimensions that create 16 personality type profiles. So first you have extroversion and introversion, E and I, which is about how you prefer to direct and receive your energy. Then we have sensing and intuition, which is about how you take in information. So that's represented by an S, and then we have an N because we've already used our I for introversion. Then we have thinking and feeling, T and F. This is about how you come to conclusions. And then we go on to look at judging and perceiving, J and P, which is about how you approach the outside world. It's important to say that language in MBTI terms is quite specific, and so try not to think about it in how you might typically know of these words. So for example, judging isn't about being judgmental. Extroversion, introversion isn't about being shy or socially confident. They have quite specific definitions in terms of MBTI, which I'll explain for some of them as we go through today. But what's important to remember is that these preference pairs are opposites. So they're described as dichotomies. And remember what we talked about when it comes to preferences. You have a preferred way of doing something. It doesn't mean you can't do the other thing. It just might be a bit less natural to you. It must take a bit more energy. It might take you a bit longer. It just might not feel quite you. So you can't prefer two ways of doing things, because you can't prefer two sides of a dichotomy. So even if you do both, and I hope you do all of these things depending on the situation, what we're trying to understand is what your actual preference might be. So just keep that in mind as we delve a bit deeper. For the purpose of today, as I've got quite a short session for you, I'm going to focus on sensing and intuition, so how you take in information. And this is shortened to S for sensing and N for intuition. So to start illustrating this, I'm going to pull it into practice for you with a bit of an example. I'd like you to just have a look at this picture. Just notice some things about it. Now, what would you do if I asked you to tell someone about this picture? So imagine you were telling someone who couldn't see the picture and you wanted to tell them about it. Would you naturally focus on things in isolation? You might take in all the facts and the details, perhaps the specific colours, the number of people and the chairs, what they're wearing. Maybe you might imagine what the weather might feel like. You might look at the different boats in the background. You might start listing the different types of boats you could see. Or instead, would you look at the whole picture all together? You might try to make sense of it, thinking about the different flags. You might be wondering what they are. You might notice that one on the left, it's not quite the Spanish flag. What do you think it could be? You might see all those boats. You might wonder, what's going on? Is there some sort of event there? What time period is it? How are those people related to each other? Or you might even think beyond the picture and you might wonder what it's called. So you can see here there's some quite different perspectives that you might be taking when it comes to looking at this picture, and that's you showing your preference in terms of how you take in information. So when I ask people to do this in terms of an MBTI sense, those with a sensing preference tend to state what's in the picture. They're likely to be quite specific. They might list things out. They focus on what's quite realistic, so what can they literally see, and they don't tend to go beyond that. They might focus on the here and now and be very focused just on the scene directly in front of them. However, those with an intuition preference might go beyond the picture and make associations. They might be engaged about the big picture. How does it all fit together? What does it all mean? They might be engaged by imagination, and they might be anticipating the future. And that's explained here by these diagrams. So if I showed these three shapes to someone with a sensing preference, and I said to them, what do you see? They might say, I see a star, I see a circle, I see a square. They might even say the squares on the left, the circles on the top, the stars on the right. They might mention the fact that it's a 5-pointed star. So they'd be quite specific with the details. However, if I asked an intuition preference person to describe what they might see, they might just say there's 3 shapes arranged in a triangle. They might not have particularly noticed that it was a 5-point star. They might be looking at how does it relate together. They might even be anticipating what might be the next shape I might see. Is there a pattern there that they're missing? So that's quite different in terms of the approaches between sensing and intuition. And so broadening out just from what do you see when you look at a picture, these are the characteristics of sensing and intuition. So sensing people want to know the facts, whereas intuition people tend to seek out new ideas. It's the difference between looking at the specifics or looking at the big picture, adopting a realistic approach or focusing on the here and now, ensuring things work in practice or ensuring things work in theory, collecting observations. So what can you see yourself, or using conceptual frameworks? What do you maybe know to be true, or you can relate based on other things you've done before? It's also important for me to say here that these images that you can see here as well, the sensing camera is kind of zoomed in. It's looking at that real individual detail. So it's being able to see the petals up really close, and you can maybe count all the little dots on the inside of the flower. But because of that, they maybe aren't noticing what's behind it. What's that big picture? They're not seeing the hills. They're not able to see all of it. Whereas on the other hand, you've got that intuition camera. So that's that kind of wide shot where you can see everything in the landscape. landscape. So you can take it all in and how it relates to each other, but what you're not necessarily seeing is the individual detail of one thing. So both of the things are valid. They both make lovely photographs, and they're both different perspectives. So just as I said at the start, there's no right or wrong types, but these just show you some different perspectives and how you can see things. And as I put at the bottom there, sensing isn't about being sensitive, and intuition isn't about gut feel. So it's not about how you might already think you understand those words. Try and think about it just in terms of sense intuition. Hopefully with these descriptions, you're starting to feel where your own type might be now, where your preference might be when it comes to taking in information. So when it comes to your stakeholders, I think it's important for you to start thinking what their preference might be. How are you presenting information? How could it play out, for example, if you're quite detailed focused and you grounded in what's happening right now, but perhaps your stakeholder is being quite forward looking, they're engaging their imagination and they're looking to the future. You could potentially start to see how you might look at things quite differently, and there might be some clashes there. So when it comes to taking in information, think about how you might go about something when you're talking to your stakeholders. What might your preference be? Are you presenting the information that's real and tangible and focusing mainly on what you can perceive using your 5 senses? Or are you perhaps presenting information by seeing the big picture and focusing on the patterns and interrelationships they perceive? But how might your stakeholders want to have their information presented to them? What might be their preference? And by preference, again, what might be the natural thing to them? What might be the easiest thing for them? What they might get the most energy for, or find the easiest way to do something? So think about that when it comes to preference and stakeholders. And potentially, how could you balance this out? Perhaps rather than just coming at things from your preference, you're able to look at things from someone else's preference. And maybe present something in a slightly more balanced way. So when it comes to thinking about how you might want to present something to a stakeholder's preference, here are some do's or don'ts if that person you're working with has got a sensing preference. When you're dealing with them, you want to keep things practical and brief with data and facts. It can also be useful to let them physically experience a product if that's possible. A sensing is named because it's to do with the affinity of the 5 senses. So those of you with physical products, if you're trying out a new material or it's going to feel a different weight or a different texture, a sensing person might actually want to physically try that out. But also, don't go off on too many tangents or link things beyond their current focus. And when you're working with someone with an intuition preference, think about the context, connect your product to the wider vision and goals, be open to exploring new ways of doing things. It's also worth staying away from too much detail and procedure to begin with and start with a wider context. So I can give you a little example there. So I have quite a strong intuition preference, whereas I've worked with people with quite a strong sensing preference. And if I ask someone to explain to me a process, just get quite a lot of them in HR, I often want them to start with how things all fit together, start quite big in terms of the conceptual of it, like who does what and what are we trying to achieve, where does it fit with everything else. What I don't want them to do is maybe start getting out a step-by-step process map or showing me where things sit in SharePoint folders and stuff. I just can't follow it, and it's just not going to be the best way to get for us to work together. And that's something I've really learned about myself, so I can be quite clear with my questions now to people, so I make sure I get the best information out of them. But if you're trying to do that with your stakeholders, you don't necessarily always know what their preference is. Not everyone has been through the MBTI process. They might not even know themselves. And even if they had been, they may not be able to tell you or want to tell you what their preference is. But there are cues you can look out for that signal what those preferences might be. So if you're dealing with someone with a sensing preference, you might hear them asking for data and proof. They might want evidence that it's worked before. And even if they aren't speaking, you might see them physically touching or trying out a product. You might notice them collecting observations in the real world. So looking around, physically weighing things, really kind of just being quite physical with what they're doing and quite present. Whereas people with an intuition preference, they might be asking you for a vision. They might be asking what you're trying to achieve. You might notice notice them when they take notes. They might be making mind maps as their mind is linking things and ideas together. And they might be thinking of things in terms of ideas and concepts rather than what do they actually know. So they might be using a bit more sort of what if language as well. Okay, so these are the sorts of things that people might be saying, and they also you might be seeing them do, because that's important as well. Not everyone knows what their preference is and not everyone will say, but when you think about your own preference and what you're trying to get across in terms of what feels most natural, most energizing for you, think also about your stakeholders and what's going to feel most natural and energizing for you, because if you come about something in the way that they want and they take in information, you're less likely to clash and you're less likely to potentially hit a barrier when it comes to getting something done with them. So let me bring this all together for you then. And your key takeaways from today, I would suggest that you start by beginning to reflect on your own preferences and then start to flex, so you're generally presenting information in a balanced way. So if you tend to approach things with a sensing preference, start to think of ways you might be able to bring in a bit of intuition to that. And similarly, if you usually do things from an intuition perspective, can you focus on some data and some facts to really bring in that kind of sensing preference? You could also look into doing the MBTI assessment if you want to do this in a bit more depth, and you could explore some of the other preference pairs as well, because as I've said, what I focused on today is only 1/4. It's only one of the 4 preference pairs. You then might want to flex your style so you're more balanced, but also you can think about your stakeholders' preferences and you can use those type cues to help you do that if needed. So if you don't quite know what their preferences are, think about those signals they're giving you. What are they telling you that they might like to hear when it comes to taking information? You could also have quite an open conversation. You could tell them about this talk. You could show it to them afterwards and get them to start thinking, and that might give you a different way to connect with them and have an open conversation about how they might like to take in information and see what you might like to tweak going forward because of that. Because although I'm telling you to be more balanced, that's the ultimate aim, you could also be quite strategic in your approach to information, and then you could tailor it to how you think your stakeholders are going to want to take in information, and they might want to get the best out of it, because it's all about preference. It doesn't mean you can't do something, but you're playing to what's the preferred way of doing something, what's most energizing, what's easy, what's most natural, what feels like you, rather than what's going to take a bit longer, feel a bit more draining, take a bit more effort. We're trying to get the best solution for you and for your stakeholders, so hopefully you guys can get the best products.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Tanya, for such an insightful talk. I think as you were going through the talk, I had quite a few light bulb moments where you start thinking about people around you and you start recognizing some of the signals and cues. So thank you. It was really, really useful.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Great. So moving forward, I will. We're actually very lucky today to have not one Tanya, but actually 2 Tanyas. So Tanya has been in product for more than 8 years, and she's had roles in companies of all sizes, starting from seed up to Series D. And she has worked on both greenfield products and also enhanced existing product propositions. Tanya is very passionate about onboarding journeys and customers' first experiences particularly, and she owns the seller onboarding in her current product role at Paddle. And in tonight's talk, Tanya will explore how getting to know your stakeholders, understanding their personalities and how they take in information, will help you grow and make better decisions for your company and for your customers. Welcome, Tanya.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So I'm Tanya, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about a human-centered approach to stakeholder management. But before we go into the details of this, I want everyone to kind of take a step back and think, what is a stakeholder? Or rather, who is a stakeholder? Is a stakeholder someone who you sometimes feel could be a blocker to your work because of certain relationships with your stakeholders? You end up not building the thing that is going to add the most value to the business. Is a stakeholder someone who at times you feel like they don't understand your role and your remit within the business and what you're here to achieve? Are stakeholders to you sometimes a group of people who you feel don't fully grasp what product management is as a function? They don't really understand how products are built, how products are designed, how we conduct user testing, how we validate concepts or come up with system designs. Is a stakeholder someone who you have a weekly or bi-weekly one-to-one set up with? And that's the meeting where you see it in your calendar and you're thinking, oh, okay, yeah, I've got that coming up. And at the end of the call, you either feel completely relieved or you feel like you're a little bit drained. And that's a call that you tell your flatmates, your partner about at dinner, or you talk about at the pub after work. Or have you ever felt that your stakeholders don't fully understand what the business-wide objectives are and how product managers work with the competing priorities and how they move forward with that? Type yes in the comments if you've ever felt like this before, and if you've ever been in any sort of similar situation. So the thing is, we've all been there and we've all unfortunately felt this way and have, some sort of war wounds. I've definitely felt like that. And at times that's felt like the worst, not the worst, the least fun part of being a product manager. And I've loved being a PM and I still love it now. But sometimes that bit, it can get you down a little bit. And now over time and with various different experiences that I've had, I've actually learned that stakeholders are enablers. And the way that I came to this conclusion is, so as we all know, product management at every business is different. And that's only partly because every product is different. So working in various different companies, I've experienced and come across a lot of things. So working in very large organizations, you have the business strategy and the product strategy, which is well mapped out. And every person, every department, and every team knows what they need to do to help the business get to where they need to be. Everyone knows their part. And the product function is carved out for you. And you usually have a very senior person within the function who is the voice of the customer at like board meetings and executive committee meetings. And then you also have small, scrappy startups, which are chaotic, but in the most fun way, where every day something is completely different. You get to work on all different types of problems and you get to move really, really fast and have incredible experiences. And I'm not sure what the experiences are of the people watching today, but from my experience, I've sometimes felt that there's an indirect and unwritten responsibility that product managers have in those companies to be the advocate for that function and essentially create a really good relationship with your stakeholders in order for them to enable you to do what you're here to do, and for you to enable them to also do their roles within the business to ensure that the customer is always put first. So through combining these experiences, I realized the best way to do my work is to enable my stakeholders. And I had to, unfortunately, learn this the hard way. And there's one key experience that really, really comes to mind. And that's something called Stakeholder Speed Dating, which was essentially a lesson, a very long lesson on how not to manage your stakeholders. And this lesson happened, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And after that experience, I learned a lot and I had a lot to reflect on. But as the years go by, I end up thinking more about it and I'm still learning from that. And that's the key example that I want to share with you today. And that's the key example that I want everyone to have takeaways from today. So what happened? So the situation was I was working at a very small, very nimble company a few years back. And there was one product and engineering team. And by that, I mean one product manager, which was myself, and about 10 to 12 engineers who weren't split into squads or anything. We were just one team, and we looked after 3 products. So these products were all built and maintained in-house. The 3 products were very different from each other. Although they were in the same sort of industry, they had the completely different user bases, so different user needs, and therefore we had to build different experiences. They're at different stages of the product lifecycle, and they also had different stakeholders. The one similarity that all 3 products had was that they were built on top of each other. So all three sets of stakeholders for each product sat upstairs. So the way the business worked was that each product ended up turning into like its own mini company. So I had 3 sets of marketing stakeholders upstairs, 3 sets of sales stakeholders, 3 sets of content team stakeholders, all upstairs, and one team to deliver and prioritize everything. And the feedback we got was that our stakeholders weren't happy about the lack of clarity. And by lack of clarity, I mean quite a few things. I mean that, so they saw the roadmap and they knew what was coming up, but the roadmap was changing a lot. And within the roadmap, they understood the what, they kind of understood the why, but not entirely. When we would have sprint demos, they would appreciate what we've built and what we're demoing and the value that it adds, but they weren't sure why that particular piece of work was prioritized over something for their product. And they didn't really have a lot of clarity on why we weren't prioritizing certain things for their products, which was all completely fair. So the solution we came up with was called Stakeholder Speed Dating. And what that was it was a monthly event on the product and engineering floor every 2 sprints, so every month. So product engineering was sat in the basement floor separate from the rest of the business. And the way this meeting ran was that one person from each product will come along and they will get all the views from all the different stakeholders within that product or mini business. And they'll fill out a document beforehand. And I'd always send an email a week before the meeting saying, please remember to fill out the document, so that myself and our COO would have a chance to read through it and formulate any questions that we have. And so the way the document worked was that the stakeholder would write out what the item was, what area it impacted, so if it's sales, commercial, internal efficiency, what problem, if we were to implement this item, what problem would it solve? And then also what the impact would be. So an example of impact would be sellers would be onboarding, the time of seller onboarding will decrease by 2 hours, or we can get 10 more signups a week on our newsletter if we were to do this. And at the time, it all made sense. That, yeah, this is the information we need from them, so let's just ask for it. Let's just ask for it straight up. But these meetings were painful. It was the most painful 90 minutes of every month. And that was for multiple reasons. There was this communal frustration, because we'd look at this document and we'd have the assumption that we've got this information, now we're ready to go ahead. And instead, we didn't understand a lot of the things that were put into the document. And when we'd have conversations with the team, we'd understand a little bit more, but not that much. The way it was structured was that the CEO and I would be on one side of the table in our area, and the stakeholders will come, and after the timer was done, I mean, sometimes we even had a kitchen timer, and once that was done, they'll swap over. And that's how we kept it short and brief. And this was not a good use of anybody's time. And this is an experience I had to learn a lot from. One of the lessons I learned was that forcing stakeholders to think like product managers is high effort and low reward. This is essentially what we were doing. By structuring the meeting in that way, we're forcing them to think like us, whereas instead we should have thought, okay, how do they work? What do they do? And then get that information and then separately distill it into the categories that are on that sheet, so that we can then make a decision on what we want to do moving forward. The way that we went about it, we made getting information a lot harder than it needed to be. We just had to have a conversation and get to know these people. And in performing this stakeholder speed dating, we ended up creating quite a bad culture within the company. We essentially created an us versus them culture. And in a company that small, this can spread like wildfire. We essentially created barriers that, okay, you are coming to our area, you kind of stick by our rules. And that's not what we should have done at all. We should have actually said, okay, how do we make this a collaborative experience? We want to learn what problems you think we need to solve. We also need to understand these problems. How can we do this together? And what we should have done is learned just how they work, what tools they use, and what their KPIs are. And the way that we figured out this point actually is because when we were kind of probing the information that they put into this document, then they'd mention other things. And you think, oh, wait, no, I actually haven't heard of that before, or I'm not that familiar with that, or how does this affect this? And then you get into these healthy conversations after about like 20 minutes of just frustration and miscommunication. And then you get a nugget of information that you roll with. But because we didn't have those healthy conversations from the beginning, we still don't, when we look back on this experience, we still don't actually know if what we were building was the best thing to build at the time for the business. And to be honest, it probably wasn't. So from this experience, when I look back on it, I think a lot about this and all the lessons that I learned. So these are lessons I learned immediately. And that as I moved on in my career, I thought about this a lot more. And the lessons actually ended up evolving. And those are the lessons that I would love to share with everybody today. So one lesson is get to know your stakeholders and their teams. So usually as product managers, we usually work with the head of a certain department or a VP of a certain department. But we don't really talk that much or interact that much with the people in their teams who our work can actually affect, and also the people who are closest to our customers. So one way that I do this at Paddle is, so we have a hybrid working model. So whenever I do go into the office, I just have a walk around and I try and make sure my calendar's a bit empty that day. And I walk around, and if I see people I work with, or I see people who work with people I work with, then I just have a chat with them, like a very open-ended question, like, how has your week been? And if they say it was end of quarter, so things are busy, okay, why is it busy? And say if someone mentions, for example, I'm trying to get an SMB live, but they're having all these issues, and I think, hey, that's actually something that I work on. And that's something that I'm investigating right now. Tell me more about it. And we really then get to see, okay, we're having open-ended conversations. And from that, we're understanding what our stakeholders' day-to-day lives are, what tools they're using. So many teams nowadays outside of product and engineering have daily stand-ups. So if you hear a team that has daily stand-ups, ask them, what do you discuss? How do you then, go ahead and prioritize your workload? How do you deal with emergencies or changes in direction? What strategic things are you working on right now? And from that, you think, okay, that actually fits in with something that I'm doing, or later down the line, it will just spark in you. And then you think of ways that you can enable them. They think of ways, it teaches them as well, ways that they can enable you, because they then think, okay, this piece of information is actually useful for them. So next time I come across something, I'll let them know. Because at the end of the day, we're all working for a better experience for the same set of customers. So we all really need to be in it together. The next thing is understand. So we've touched on understanding their day-to-day, but also understand their ambitions. Every team have KPIs and OKRs that they're reaching towards. But have we ever thought about, okay, what is this team's overall ambition in the next 6, 12, 24 months? What do they want to be? What are they working towards? Are they actually thinking of getting rid of all their tools and just having one tool that does it all? Are they thinking we actually want to focus more on one type of marketing as opposed to something else? Really understand that stuff and see where you can be an asset to them just through a conversation. And that will really help build that sort of great partnership and relationship, but in a very natural way. And also, not every conversation needs to be transactional. Naturally, if you're walking around the office and you have a chat with someone, it might end up being transactional, and that is completely fine. You are in a working environment. But not every conversation has to start off in that way. And also, just a point, if you are remote yourself or you have remote colleagues, this is equally as easy to do. You can just send them a Slack and say, oh, look, I saw that you've got a couple hours free this week, especially on this afternoon. How about we have an impromptu coffee catch up? Without an agenda, it would just be good to catch up and kind of figure out what that person is like, if they prefer that over a Zoom call or typing over Slack, and just get to know them that way. And also find other ways to help. So a really good example is at my previous company, we had a very tight deadline on launching a new product, and we had very limited engineering resources. But I was working with our operations team, and there's a few items they really wanted built from us. And after working with them and understanding what the impact is and what the value is to the business and how much it will essentially cost us, I really wanted to get this done for them because I worked so closely with that team. I empathized for them. I could see the value this could bring. But I had to say to them, sorry, we won't actually be able to touch this up until in about 2 quarters' time, but I can't even guarantee we'll look at it then. It also depends on priorities closer to the time. And I was quite disappointed in this, but that's part of the role. And they were quite disappointed as well, naturally. So what I did was I just took 15 to 30 minutes out, thought about everything I know about that team. How do they run day to day? What do they do? What are their pain points? And what are our customers' pain points? And I just came up with a couple of ideas, a couple of things they could do that doesn't require any sort of engineering resource, but can help them have some impact towards their goals. But unfortunately not as much as if we actually built it in-house for them. And I just sent it over to them and I said, look, this is your domain. Please tell me to go away. If none of these suggestions are welcome. I just had a quick think, and this is what I came up with. And those sorts of conversations are healthy because end of the day, we are product managers and therefore we're problem solvers. And in that, through problem solving is another way to just naturally help out your stakeholders and help out your team. Because when you're helping them, you're helping the business and you're all part of the same business and helping the same helping the same users. So from my past experiences, I have a few key tips and takeaways. The first one is stakeholders are masters at what they do. They are incredible marketeers, incredible data scientists. They're all hired for a particular reason. That should be celebrated and learned more about and understand how you can help them and how they can help you. The second is form genuine human connections. Everything I mentioned in the previous slide, for me in previous roles, it's been quite easy to do because I've genuinely just really enjoyed the people that I work with. I've liked them as people. I enjoy having conversations with them. If this is something that's important to you, but you don't find that you're having that in your company, then maybe rethink the culture, maybe what you can do to help facilitate this. Because if you try and have those conversations, but they're not genuine, it's a lot of effort and you may not have as much reward. And my final key tip is be curious. We as product managers are so fortunate that we get to work with people all across the business with different skill sets and different backgrounds. Let's embrace that. Let's be curious about different departments and see how every department actually then helps the customers that we are all here for. So thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions or wants to have a chat, then feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or drop me an email.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Tanya. I think the tip, or rather suggestion, that the most resonated with me was the fact that not every conversation should be transactional. I think having been through the pandemic, it, like, as you said, it kind of like loses the informality of it, where even to have a casual conversation, you need to send somebody an invite. You can't just stop by their desk. So I think that's probably an important tip that we might forget day to day.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tanya. And next up, we have our final speaker. Our final speaker today is Shobit. He's a coach that has helped hundreds of product managers and product leaders to excel in their careers. His journey to coaching for product managers came about when he experienced a major life transformation brought about by an intense focus on self-development, mindfulness, and high performance. In the past, Shobit has worked as a product manager at Google for Crashlytics, the world's most popular mobile app crash reporter, and he was also a management consultant at McKinsey. Shobit will give you a very simple framework which you can use to monitor and systemically improve stakeholder relationships, just like you would iterate a product.
Thank you so much, Elina. I really appreciate it. Everyone can hear me? I think you can, so I'll get going. So, hey everyone, I'm Shobit, or you can just call me not Tanya. That was my one dad joke for the day. We'll move past. We'll also move past this slide because I was going to use a Star Wars analogy and explain why relationships are important. But after the last two speakers, you guys get that. So I'll jump right into the meat of the conversation. So there's four big things that, well, there's a picture of Baby Yoda, so that's always cute. But there's four big things that I'll focus on, all with the goal of adding, as Tanya, our first speaker mentioned, it's about the human aspect. But I'm a very analytical person, so I want to bring some analytical frameworks for you to think about deeply about some of these relationships. Use the MBTI angle, make connections human, but also use this framework in addition to help you think about the different kinds of relationships. So the four big things we'll talk about is who are the people you want to build a better relationship with. Let's really try to focus on which people are the ones that, if you invested more time in, you'll get the maximum return. Just recognizing that as product managers, our time is super limited. Then being clear on what we hope to get out of these relationships and how we hope to contribute. Next, a framework to understand where do you stand right now in this relationship, and what are systematic ways where you can move this forward. So those are the four things that we will be covering. Now, you can apply this framework for any relationship. It doesn't have to be stakeholder relationships. Could be personal relationships, but just with a little bit of caution. I'm not a personal relationship coach. I'm a career coach, and so that my focus will be on stakeholder relationships. You've heard about me. You don't need to say more about me. So let's move on to the first part. Who? So when we think of stakeholders, this I like to break it down into essentially three categories. So there's a very awesome article. I don't know if anybody follows Black Box of PM. It's one of the best blogs in product management. And one of the things, one of the concepts there was that as a product manager, what you're really trying to do is you are trying to guide a ship through towards its end goal. You're trying to build a product to ultimately meet certain OKRs or solve certain problems for customers. And there's all these things in the environment that are throwing you off track, and you're constantly course correcting. Those could be you launch something and it doesn't work, technically it doesn't work, or there's just not enough product market fit and whatnot. And you're always iterating and working through those things. And so the way I think of, as you're moving through this rocket ship, there's three categories of stakeholders. So number one are people who are your accomplices. They are on the team, on the rocket ship, and they can help you advance the product forward. Classic example, your engineers, your designers, your engineering lead, so on and so forth. The second category, which most of us consider as the classic definition of stakeholders, are your advocates, or people who you want to be your advocates. They can help you get resources. They can help you generate influence within the organization. They can also block your progress. So that's your advocate category. And the third kind, which I feel just as coaching product managers, that very often we overlook are your advisors. So your advisors are people who typically don't have power in the organization. They don't affect the course of that project too much, but they're the ones who can give you advice, coaching, and encouragement. So a mentor is, for example, a good example of this. Or for me, working in Google, just other people who were senior in the organization, they were not directly involved in my projects, but they knew a lot about other people and could give me insights on what drives other people. Building those relationships was just something that was really useful. And then, of course, anybody like a career coach, a mastermind group, those are all advisors that very often that's the category we end up neglecting, especially when we get so busy with shipping products and listening to Mind the Product talks and everything. Billing advisors is the thing that falls out. The first thing I just wanted to leave you was think of the key people that you want to build the relationship with in all these categories. Your accomplice is important, your advocates are important, your advisors are just as important. Okay, so now that we have that, let's talk about relationships in terms of how could we analyze it and figure out where do these relationships stand right now. And here I want to bring about Amy Cuddy's framework. So Amy Cuddy is a very famous psychologist from Harvard University. She wrote the book Presence, about body language, and she's most famous for the Superman or the Superwoman pose, where you just stand like this for a few minutes, and that increases your confidence. Those sort of things. But the other thing that she's probably a little bit less known for is a very powerful framework of how people perceive you. And she broke it down into 2 dimensions, and I'll be using that. Um, so the 2 dimensions are when somebody meets you or you meet them. You're trying to, in some sense, try to figure out where does this person stand, and you are asking 2 core questions. One, can you trust them? As in, do they have your best interests at heart? Are they friendly? Are they going to be kind? Those kind of things. And second, can you respect them? As in, are they competent at their job? Do they have certain amount of social status? And psychologists refer to these dimensions as warmth and competence, or trust and competence. And in an ideal world, you want to be perceived as having both. So this framework, applying it a different way, when you think of your relationship to any stakeholders, if you just mapped it out on, let's say, trust being the y-axis, where the top of the y-axis is that you absolutely trust them, that they have your best interests at heart, and the negative one is you don't trust them at all, you mistrust them. And then the x-axis is the competence, where like on the negative side, they just don't have the skills for the job. They're what people might refer to as incompetent. And then on the right side is that they're great at the job. So I have a confession to make here. When I was younger, I made this mistake. I'm just kidding though, of spending 2 years as a management consultant. And that has permanently altered my worldview, where everything is a 2x2 matrix. And so you'll definitely see that a lot during this talk. But coming back to where the relationship stands, this is a very powerful tool of quickly thinking, hey, so from my perspective, if I looked at my relationship with stakeholder X, how do I perceive them? Do I trust them? And on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do I trust them? And then, do I believe that they're competent? And you could do the same from their perspective. Like, what do you think? How do they perceive you? Do they trust you? Or they don't? And then, of course, do they think you're competent or don't? And the reason why this is so powerful is it will relate with tactics I'm going to give you very soon about how do you start to increase some of the trust and competence elements. there's different approaches depending on what's going on. But even as I've coached PMs, just thinking through your relationship in this framework has been really eye-opening. Uh, uh, one of my clients, he was a pretty senior PM and wasn't getting along with his manager. And the more we dug in and analyzed using this approach, really what it came down to, that they both seem to really respect each other. As in, this person's competent, they know their stuff, nothing wrong with that. It's a trust that has gone wrong. And it's gone wrong because in the initial part of the relationship, there was some misalignment of incentives, of objectives. And so now that just trust has disappeared. So we focused our entire work on building that trust back up rather than focusing on competence elements and proving their worth and whatnot. And just a very different outcome had we misdiagnosed the situation and focused on the other side of things. Cool. So, okay, so we've had enough matrices for the day. So let's talk more about some animals. So how do you increase trust? So I want to leave you with, I wish I'd actually put picture of, I have two cats, Sherlock and Ahsoka. That would have been a good background, but anyway, that's not on the slide. But I want to leave you with 4 ways. And look, there's a million different ways of increasing trust, but typically I found these 4 to be the most common, most useful way of thinking about how do you start to build up that aspect of the relationship, if that has been the one missing. So the first one is finding common beliefs, finding common things that you have in common with each other. And it's just something that I think, pre-pandemic was even easier. You two are in a meeting room waiting for other people and you're chatting, and I guess that still happens in the pandemic world, even if you're having remote meetings. But this is where you're trying to find common ground without being, that sleazy salesperson who's always just trying to has this set of prepared questions and trying to find those common things to talk about, but just in a very genuine way, looking at what are the things that are common across both of you. A great way of starting to build that trust. And what I find most useful is common ground around beliefs. The way you value the world, the things that you value in life, that deeper level. I think that's really what starts to build that trust connection. So that'd be number one. Second is this simple thing that somehow when we get busy, we lose, which is appreciating other people. And recognition for what you've done, that is just such a thing that everyone craves for. I mean, even when I'm coaching and going through deep career conversations, it's like, hey, I want to get that director title. Like, okay, let's talk through what's driving that. Is it the need for more money? Is it the need for all these other things? But really, like, so many times that comes down to, oh, that would be a signal that my contributions and my work had been acknowledged and appreciated in the organization. And that's driving so many people's careers. It's super interesting that I know that can drive and highly increase the level of relationships. Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace so that I can cover everything in time. Cool. The third one, a great way of increasing trust is actually listening to people, taking their advice, and especially as you're thinking of building those relationships with advisors and advocates, listening intently, asking for advice and perspective, and following through. In the sense that I listen to a lot of advice. I don't follow along most of it, just a little pig-headed, but I always circle back. I'm like, hey, thank you for that advice. I ended up going another direction, but I appreciate you sharing that thought with me. Or when I do follow it, this is where also we mess up sometimes, which is we followed it, it was super useful, and then just never circled back. And an opportunity for connection has gone. And then last but not least, support people by doing things with them, always be looking out to help them. And this automatically generates the reciprocity, which is just a very standard thing that we're all used to as humans, which is if somebody does something for us, we should do something back for them as well. So that is the trust side, and I want to leave you now with the other side, which is how do you increase competence in a relationship? So in the sense that how do you get the other person to believe more about your competence? And of course, you can return the favor for that. So increasing confidence in your competence. So the one thing that I want to lay out as we start to talk about this is a general concern that I hear from product managers all the time, which is that, look, I don't want to boast. I don't want to sell my work. I don't want to oversell my work. That's just not me. And that belief is costing a lot of people a lot of things in their careers. It's costing their teams effectiveness. It's just something that needs to be eliminated. Selling your work and the value you provide is just as important as doing the work. And it's not that you're actually trying to do harm to the organization. You're doing the right thing for the organization by making good work known, by making your team's achievements lauded and applauded, and just paving the path for the future. So with that being said, let's talk about how do you increase confidence in your competence. First, showcase and share wins. Whether it's digests that happen every other week or using company show and tells to highlight things that have happened. You can do that without always getting on stage and saying, hey, look how awesome I am. You don't need to do that. And wins that matter specifically to certain people, those are the things you really want to highlight. And look, wins can be anything. Achievement of an OKR, overachievement of a goal, launching a product, learning some things from customers, learning something about the organization that you shared. Those are all wins that you can share. So showcasing is number one. Okay, the second one, if somebody thinks sort of they're not sure about you if you're competent enough, one great way for you to get on the same level playing field as them on the level of competence is very simply by giving them feedback. And this is so crucial, where I remember, with a lot of trepidation, giving this feedback to this venture capitalist who came to a conference where I also spoke. He also spoke, and he was telling us all about how awesome he was as a presenter. And he used and I don't know how many times. So I just counted it for part of his presentation. And I shared feedback in a very kind way that, look, I noticed that you pride yourself in your ability to speak, but I noticed when you were using the slide, you used and so many times in a minute. However, when you were not using slides, you seem to never use it. So maybe there's something going on here about your relationship. Just thought I'll share with you. And, person really appreciated it. But it was a risk. But what I want to encourage everyone is to share this feedback with people. And, the fact that you showed the courage as well as the caring, the concern to share that feedback, it's just dramatically useful, and a great way for them to now start to be like, yeah, this person, if they can give me feedback, they're just now mentally putting you in a very different box, and they start to believe in your competence a lot more. And then the last thing I would really encourage everyone to do is to stand up for your ideas. Show your backbone. I actually don't know if that's a phrase. I just made up some crap. But anyway, stand up for what you feel is important, And I think a great testament, my last manager that I worked with at Google, what she persisted. She was trying to drive certain changes in the organization. And one thing she was really good at was, driving that drumbeat for a year, maybe even more, until it took the time for us to build up the practices, the infrastructure, and everything to move the organization in the right direction. So the big thing here is when your ideas do get shot down, when you do see that lack of confidence, that's just sort of to be expected. You're telling people to do new things. Of course, the first reaction would be, yeah, I'm not going to do it. But when they see you stand up for it over and over again and do the drumbeat, people start to believe. A big part is they just need to get familiar with your ideas more for them to start to move in that direction. And this is also an awesome way to increase their confidence in your competence. So just summing up, I don't have a slide on summing up. The big things are, remember, there's 3 types of relationships you're building: advocate, advisor, and your accomplice. You can easily start to map out where the relationships stand by using that trust and competence matrix. And last but not least, please, go back and use all these different methods to start to move systematically the relationship forward in the dimensions you think it's lacking based on that diagnosis. And I would love to hear about how your experience went and generally connect. So please definitely reach out through LinkedIn or through my website. All my contact information is also there. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Shabir. That was a really interesting talk. I think I do love a good matrix, so I can understand your appreciation for them. But I do also think that your mention of trust and how you can build trust really reiterated Tanya's point that you shouldn't forget about these casual conversations and getting to know your stakeholders so that you can build trust through actually being on the same page and understanding their beliefs and understanding, what brings you onto the same grounds. We have a bit of a shy audience tonight. However, I do have a couple of questions that came up, and maybe we'll get a few more questions from the audience. So, Tanya, when you started your presentation, you were kind of like talking in a more negative sense about kind of like situations where stakeholders are more painful, that are not as engaging. So, how it takes two to tango. So, if you want to build a relationship with a stakeholder, but they're not willing to play ball or like not willing to collaborate, what do you do in that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. It's definitely a situation that I've found myself in a few times. I'm sure other people in the audience have also found themselves in. In those situations, I spend more time, I take a step back from them. I don't want to then become that annoying person who's like, hi, have a coffee with me. Hi, hang out with me. So I give them some space. And then what I do is I just speak to them. Okay, so we need to work together on X, Y, Z. So we're laying out all the work that we need to do and what we need from each other. Let's talk about ways of working. So the kind of information that I'm going to be asking from you is this, this, and this. But the reason why I'm asking you is because in order for me to do my part of the work that we're doing, I need to know this, and this is the reason why. And then we end up, and then what I've noticed is once you actually sit down and explain to someone why you're asking them, then that relationship starts to form. And over time, you start to have more calls, and then the calls slowly move from completely transactional with a strict agenda to, oh, hey, how, like they mentioned they're doing something over the weekend. The next day you ask, so after that weekend is gone, then you say, oh yeah, how was that thing? And then you slowly kind of move into a place where you're more comfortable with each other. So you're able to have more open conversations with each other. And I actually recently had this, and once we just established ways of working, and really turns out that person has never worked with product managers before, has never worked with anyone outside of their own function, let alone someone from technically a digital department. So once I just explained how things work and what our company culture is like and how collaborative it is, our relationship, it took a while, but it just essentially blossomed. And now I really look forward to having calls with that particular stakeholder. When they come into the office, I get excited because I want to catch up with them for a coffee and I like to think they're also getting excited to see me too.
Cool. Any other tips from anyone? Tanya, Shabit? Oh, did I freeze up?
No, sorry. I couldn't find my button. Sorry. No, I don't have anything to add. But can I ask a follow-up question to what Tanya's just said?
Go for it.
I was going to say, Tanya, a lot of what you talked about, and Shabit, this might cross over with some of your talk as well. It seemed to be very focused on in-person interaction, and I guess I'd love to understand now with the lockdown and remote working, and even now we take a lot of places are hybrid. A lot of this feels really natural in person, but I personally would find some of it a bit unnatural when you're remote or hybrid working. Have you guys got any tips for those kind of environments to make these great concepts work, but remotely?
Yeah, so what I've been doing on my current team is because I think more people are remote than hybrid actually. And so that's when I'll just look at their calendars and I see, oh, okay, you know what, Wednesday afternoon, they actually don't have any meetings. So I just send them a Slack saying, oh, hey, notice that you haven't got anything booked in on Wednesday. Do you fancy just having a coffee catch up or something? And they might turn around and say, I actually wanted to keep that afternoon free for focus work. I'm like, okay, sure, let me know when you're ready. And then they'll just Slack me saying, oh, I'm having, a bit of a dip in my afternoon. Do you want to have a 15-minute catch up? So that's how I've been doing it. And we also have loads of cross-team socials, which has helped a lot because that way people who are remote but don't work with other people remote are able to socialize with them and interact with each other. So having those every couple of weeks is quite helpful in getting to know each other as well. I agree. Well, from my personal experience, it's been harder doing it remotely, and it feels a bit more natural in person. But I guess that's just how the world is at the moment. We just need to make sure we're making that conscious effort to include our colleagues who are remote.
Yeah. And I'll just add one thing to what Tanya said, which is that definitely seen that it's more unnatural, but also people want it. Like, when people have reached out and said, hey, let's do this, there's been like super receptive. And so I think it's worked out really well for most people.
Shabit, I have a question for you. You mentioned that it's really important to maybe brag a little bit about what you're doing, what your team is doing, and basically showcase your team's work. What are some of the ways that you can do that, specifically in like big organizations where you might have a large amount of teams, a large amount of departments, everybody's super busy, there's loads of Slack channels going on, there's a lot of noise. How do you give visibility to the work and the team?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of things that really work for people is just bi-weekly digest about product updates and what's going on. And what has worked for some of my clients is sending like a digest, not as more like a engineering update, but it's from the product manager's desk. It's more about metrics, about business impact, about shipping product, also about things that they learned from customers, and sharing that. That's definitely been useful. The second one has been using whatever channels are available in terms of company show and tells or department show and tells, or even casually mentioning that at the starting of meetings. I think that's another way it's useful. And then the last thing I would say is that I don't see this more as a thing that you're trying to broadcast, but it's actually you're trying to target specific people with specific messages. So just as an example, sending out that broad email with the product update is useful, but even more useful, just icing to the cake, takes 2 minutes, is forwarding it to a specific stakeholder and saying, hey, I know you really wanted to, you were interested in this thing. And so I included that information in this update. You can take a look. And that's what people appreciate. It's like, oh, this person thought about me specifically. And I think that's a huge ROI in terms of time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. And then I think Tanya, to finish off our little Q&A, Tanya had a question for Tanya.
Yes, I did have a question. So Tanya, I really enjoyed your talk, and I have one question. So we talked about the different types of like aspects of people's personalities and figuring out if they're one or the other. From your experience, do people ever switch from one type to another type? And if they do, is it a smooth transition, or is it something that happens in their life that triggers a change?
Really, really interesting question. Thank you so much for asking it. So the kind of MBTI theory is that everyone has an innate preference. That is who you are, and that is what you prefer to do things. And then what you learn to do is you learn to flex your style to suit the environment and to suit the needs. And how much you flex depends on how often you do it and why you might need to do it. So a good example is the judging and perceiving preference, which was the last one. So that is all about people with a perceiving preference like to keep their options open, and they don't like to come to decisions too early. Whereas people with a judging preference tend to be really sort of planned and structured, and they like closure. So they like to make a decision as early as possible. So then they're able to kind of put those plans into action as soon as they can. And what you tend to hear is people with that perceiving preference maybe think that they're a judging preference, or they have to behave that way because that's the way school or work is structured. Like you should do your homework first before you have your fun time, or work is always about doing your Gantt chart for your projects and what you need to do. So they're not necessarily used to having it that way. So some people might feel like they're always acting out of their preference, even though it's not. So sometimes you see that, but you also hear in theories is that potentially later in people's life, so midlife and beyond, they might start taking up hobbies that they never used to do. So someone might suddenly start doing poetry or a sport that they never got to do in a later time in life because they're maybe a bit more comfortable in themselves, the situation allows them. And that's when their other non-preferred ways of doing things start to come to the surface. And often people talk about that being really energizing and really enjoyable, but it can look to other people like the midlife crisis that you hear about, and you suddenly think, gosh, that person's really acting out of character. Sometimes that's just them exploring a preference that they've not had a chance to do before. And I guess to your question, how smooth it is depends on maybe how well they've used it in earlier parts of their life, because ideally if you're flexing all the time, you're being really balanced, it should be really smooth. You shouldn't notice that someone's switching back and forth. But if someone only ever does things the way they want to do things, if they suddenly start using the opposite preference, that might be a bit, oh, what's going on here? They might not be as good as that. Because one thing we do say then, Mita, is preference is about preference. It's not about skill. So just because you prefer doing something doesn't mean you're particularly good at it. So I might have a preference for singing karaoke. It doesn't mean I'm very good at karaoke. So that comes out sometimes with how people use things. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it really does. This is really fascinating stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Likewise, I've never been big into psychometric testing, but I think it might be an action item after today's meetup.
That's good for me to hear.
Well, awesome. If there's no more questions from the audience, then we'll just wrap up. And thank you, everybody, for participating. Feel free to share the link around. And we'll welcome you in the next month's ProductTank event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.